this week, we're talking about listening, which is kind of a funny subject, right? So you're going to listen, and I'm going to talk, and I'm going to tell you how to listen. Got that full circle there? So if there's questions that come up, because we can be a bit informal, you can ask me afterwards, or maybe you can try asking me in the talk. We'll see how that goes. Someone suggested that might be a fun thing to try. So if there is something, feel free to pipe up in case you get lost or anything like that. So what I wanted to talk about really was this whole concept about active listening and being present. So we talk about being present in the moment, and we talk about active listening, which is a very big concept within psychology. People teach you that for how to be an active listener when you're at work now. They talk about all kinds of different qualities of what active listening looks like. But there's also a spiritual side to active listening, which is a little bit different. So I want to sort of unpack some of what those two pieces are so that we can start to, elevate our listening skills to the next highest level that's possible. So one of the things that we talk about is a nonviolent communication expert named Marshall Rosenberg, who actually wrote a book by the same name. He says, when you're busy judging people, you have no time to love them. When you're busy judging people, you have no time to love them. So that's sort of your first clue about what active listening and being present to your listening is actually about. And here's another one that comes from another guy who probably has quite a bit of experience in understanding what active listening can do, not just to transform the individual, but to transform things at a much broader level. How many of you have heard of Aaron Gandhi? So Aaron Gandhi is the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. So he was literally at the feet of Mahatma Gandhi when all of the changes were occurring in India. And he says the reason why active listening is so important and being present is so important is he says violence is more than our actions. It begins in our thoughts, which is, of course, what we specialize in here. It begins in our thoughts, and then it expands into our words. So when we're active listening, we get an opportunity to start being conscious of what's going on with the other person, and then we start to choose our words wisely, provided we're doing the active listening in the first part. So the beginning part is listening to the other person and then allowing that positive or clear communication to take place. So he says nonviolence means allowing the positive that's already within us to emerge, and that we need to dominate our thoughts with love, respect, understanding, appreciation, and compassion. It's a long list, and it's a heavy list, but I have a few tricks that I'm going to give you that'll make it much easier for you to figure out whether you're able to tick all those items off on your box. So one of the elements, this would be the psychology elements of active listening. So you've got the nonverbal elements. So one thing would be to just smile. As simple as that. If you're having a nonverbal communication with somebody, smile. I was at a wedding recently, a happy occasion, and there were a few people in the wedding party who were having challenges smiling, which is interesting, right? What are they communicating when they're not able to smile in a wedding party? I don't know the people well enough. Could be they're just really shy, right? Could be that they just don't like standing. Public speaking is a big fear. So it could be that there's all kinds of things going on. But smiling communicates immediately. That's a big one. Making eye contact is another big one. We've all been in situations where we've worked with people who maybe can't make eye contact or don't want to make eye contact. That becomes a level of separation. If we can't make eye contact, we're not speaking soul to soul. Another one is our posture. How engaged are we? If we're wanting to communicate with somebody, we want to be engaged, we tend to lean forward, right? Not aggressively forward, but we lean into the listening so that we can have that experience. And then the other piece is to try our best to avoid distraction. So if I'm talking to you, I keep my eyes on you, and I try my best not to talk to Corey to check to make sure everything's going okay, even if I'm tempted, and I might be tempted, but I keep my eyes focused as much as I can, right? So it's tricky, but you want to be able to do that. And then the other side of it is the verbal thing, so positive response, something that allows the person to continue and feel comfortable continuing. And then remembering maybe previous conversations. Oh yeah, remember you talked about that before. So how is, your mother doing, or whatever it is? That makes people know that you've got that connection that's inside them. Asking them questions. This is always a tricky one for me. I found that since I'm no longer a journalist, I have a really hard time asking questions. Because as a journalist, I was given license to ask any question, including the aggressive ones. I could ask the really nice ones, and the aggressive ones, and the inquisitive ones, and just the really sort of semi-pushy inquisitive ones. There was a long range, and people kind of weren't really allowed to say no, right? So I kind of had a really broad range with questioning. Now that I'm on the other side and I'm no longer in that, I'm a little bit more reticent about the questions. I want to feel somebody out a little bit more. So you have to be careful with questions so that you move from being curious as opposed to inquisitive or lawyer-like, right? That's got a different energy attached to it. And then reflection and clarification. So if you don't understand, feeling comfortable enough to sort of feed it back and clarify. So those are just the psychology version of what active listening looks like. But the spiritual version is something that's quite different from that. So I want to give you a little bit that actually comes from a Jewish practice, and the term is called, I've just got to scroll back here. It's called, I don't want to make a mistake, hang on one sec. It is called, it's way down here. Shema, S-H-E-M-A, Shema. And it is to hear, to listen, to pay attention, to understand, to internalize, to respond, and to obey. And Rabbi Sachs, he refers to Judaism as the religion of listening. So we're listening to the other on the human realm, but the bigger thing is we're trying to listen to the spiritual realm. So that requires a listening of our inner voice. And what does that sound like? What does our inner voice sound like? The more time we get to spend with our inner voice and figuring out what that sounds like, the more clarity we get about who we are, who we want to be in the world, how we want to live our lives, and how we are connected and connecting with our purpose, our spiritual purpose of what Source, God, whatever you want to call it, that inner part within us, what it wants for us too. So it's about looking into ourselves and finding that inner peace and understanding. So with the spiritual listening practice, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get into ourselves. And one of the best ways to get into ourselves is through meditation. By stilling our mind and practicing being within, we start to get little glimmers of what that inner voice sounds like. And it can actually start to give us direction as to when we're making a mistake. And sometimes if we catch ourselves quickly enough, we can sort of redirect ourselves in the moment. But there are also those times when we don't catch ourselves and it becomes a little bit more difficult to redirect. So then we get a signal, we feel uncomfortable, we come back to getting grounded again, and we try again. We are a work in progress, right? And the spiritual voice that we have that's within us is always a reflection of that work in progress. Our relationship to that spiritual voice within us is really, really vital to be able to having the communication that we want to have. So if we don't, for example, practice loving ourselves, how do you think that communication with our inner self is going to go? If we have a little soundtrack in our mind that keeps saying, you know, you're not good enough, we know that's the ego voice, but it'll get in the way of us being able to hear the voice that's underneath that is ready and wanting to tell us, you actually know exactly what to do in this moment. You know exactly how to speak in this moment. You know exactly what this person needs, and you know exactly when to be still and when to respond and how to do that. It's a lot of inner trust that goes on. And so getting rid of that ego mind and at least being able to differentiate between the ego mind and the inner mind is really important for us to be able to do that. So one of the things that people talk about is be the Buddha. Don't just stand there, or don't just do something, stand there. Don't do anything. Just sit. Just sit and allow that silence to be somewhat uncomfortable perhaps, but possibly better. If you're in dialogue with someone and it gets tense, if you move into silence, there's an opportunity that opens up for that other person to speak a little bit more deeply. They may assume that you don't understand, and so now you get a little more information about where they're coming from. You get a little bit more of a window into their soul and what they may need in order to feel heard. So I think about a conversation with, let's just take the typical teenager and mom, teenage girl, mom dynamic, okay? So teenage girl has decided that she doesn't really like cleaning her room anymore. And she really doesn't like doing the dishes anymore. And she really doesn't like doing a lot of that kind of stuff. But it's driving mom crazy. And so she's now elevated. And now you've got the big blowout that's happening. One of the things to do is to sort of figure out, well, what is it within me? What's my still small voice asking for within me? What am I needing in my house? And maybe in my house I'm needing peace. And maybe the girl is needing control. So if I come to this and I understand my inner voice is a need for peace and a need for tranquility, which looks like cleanliness, right? Then we can have a different kind of conversation than if I'm just in reaction mode to the teenage girl that's doing her thing. Now I can help facilitate her hearing her small voice. So what is it that's happening for you that you need this? Now I can get curious and ask those questions in a compassionate, loving kind of way so that I can start to have a different experience. And now what's happened is we're bonding instead of dismantling. Very different kind of experience and a different kind of energy. And we can use this in all kinds of situations. We can use this at home, we can use it at work, and certainly you've seen it areas where it could be used, you know, in diplomatic relations, right? Really good diplomatic relations are pretty good at this kind of thing. They figure out where is our common ground? Where are we in unity with each other? Where are we seeing soul to soul, eye to eye? How can we get closer to that in our communication and in our listening and in our stillness? So there's another fellow named David Rico, and he talks about adult relationships and how to have strong relationships as adults. And I was thinking about some of the cases where I've had really poor communications in my intimate relationships, and then really good communications in my intimate relationships. And so I'm just going to tell you, if you put a lawyer and a journalist in a room together, it's not a good combination. I can just tell you that right now. So my father is a lawyer and I was a journalist. So there was always that, well, my questions are more important than your questions, and you better answer my questions, et cetera, et cetera. Like there was a competition thing going on in our dynamic and in our relationship. There was very little positive listening. There was forced listening. You sit down and you listen to me. And then there was me pleading listening, but there wasn't active, spiritual, heart-to-heart listening. So what do you think happened to that relationship? Any guess? Yeah, it didn't go very well. In fact, it went down the tubes. It became a classic, estranged father-daughter relationship. So in the 4 years between the beginning of the dismantling and the end of the dismantling, let's put it that way, I did a lot of soul searching around what my part was in that, what role did I have to play in creating that experience. And a lot of it did have to do with understanding that my active listening skills, my spiritual listening skills were poor, that I wasn't listening very closely to my inner heart, that I wasn't even really sure what it was. I was in so much fear and so much judgment and so much positioning, if I can put it that way, that it was really hard for us to have a real conversation. But I kept working on it, and I kept working on it, and I kept doing my spiritual mind treatment work, and I'm not kidding when I say 4 years. Kept doing all of this work, and eventually, one day, I asked my sister, do you think my dad wants to see me? Because I'm not, I send emails and birthday cards, but I never get anything coming back. And she said, well, I don't know, but maybe we could find out. And so she made the first official human-to-human volley, because my attempts were not working. And we met with my sister there, the mediator among us. And I did my treatment work before I went into that meeting. And I was nervous. I was quite nervous. But I got my shaking, because sometimes I can physically shake. I got my shaking under control. And I decided, you know what I'm going to do? I am just going to work the hardest I possibly can to just have my heart wide open, like super wide open, more wide open than I've ever been before. And trust me, a year earlier, there's no way I could have done that. I would have got all tensed up in my throat. I couldn't speak sometimes. I had a nervous cough that was showing up that lasted for 8 months, and I knew it was that. It wasn't bronchial or anything. I knew all of those things. It was all up here. And so we sat across the table from each other, and I told him how much I cared about him. And then I didn't say anything. And then he started to talk. And I just kept holding that love in between the two of us. I didn't say anything. I just, as much as I could, passed it over to him, held his eyes, sent love in whatever capacity I felt I could, because I truly do love him. Doesn't mean that there weren't conflicts, but I truly do. And he just melted right in front of me. Tears came down his eyes. And I won't say it was all gone, but man, oh man, it was no longer a glacier. It wasn't even an iceberg anymore. There was a lot that shifted that day. And so today I met with him again. And I've met him numerous times, but sometimes 3 or 4 months can go by, sometimes 6 months can go by. And I met with him again. And now when we meet, it's an instantaneous, hey, how you doing? Totally different. Would have been impossible before. Totally, utterly different. And I do the same practice. And interestingly, I still get nervous. Every single time I go, I get nervous. But I open my heart to them as much as I can. And I just allow whatever comes. I try my best to just accept and allow him to be who he is and allow me to be who I am. So I'm very careful that I don't say anything that's out of integrity with who I am. If he asks a question, I answer it honestly. I try not to rattle on forever. And I do my best. So that was that experience. So another experience is that child of divorced parents, and then I ended up getting divorced. So, intimate relationships, that dynamic, sometimes challenging. And yes, I had yelling matches with my ex-husband. I think, honestly, I did most of the yelling, honestly. And I knew that when I got into a relationship again, I didn't want to do that. I knew that that was not who I wanted to be. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. I couldn't even believe, really. I was, in 5 years into this teaching, and here I was coming home yelling, like at the top of my lungs, as much as I possibly could, it seemed, right? Obviously not feeling very heard, but that's another story. So my job is to listen, though, and my job is to communicate in a loving way and to listen to my inner heart. And so now I'm in a new relationship and have been for 10 years. And we both have times when we get to that point where there's tension for whatever reason, tension that shows up. And we have to make a decision about how do we want to communicate the tension that's right in front of us. And so one of the most beautiful things that's been demonstrated to me over and over again has been this ability to allow, an ability to say, you know what, I really, really love you. And I'm talking about what my partner does for me, okay? So this is it's me reflecting what I receive from him. He says, I really love you. He doesn't actually say that very often, but in his way of being, he says that to me. And he says, and I don't want you to be anything other than who you are, ever. So you're always at choice. And I promise to accept you, whoever you are. But that doesn't necessarily mean that means we're together forever, because I need to be in integrity with who I am. So you are who you are, and I accept you for that. I am who I am. Can we have a conversation about what's happening here so that I can get a better understanding of where you're at? And then I can decide if I'm still in. It is the thing of beauty, because now I'm at choice to share the biggest truth of who I am, knowing that I'm loved. And he's at a choice, and he feels that he's at a choice to be at who he is, and knows that he is loved if I'm willing to share. It's scary every single time because I don't want to lose him. But the truth is, if I hide who I am, I will lose him anyway. Right? I will lose it anyway because I am no longer in integrity with myself. And that will then lead me down the pathway towards that yelling person that I don't want to be. Those conversations have a lot of listening. They have a lot of silence. And there's a lot of room that we give each other to just process and just be with that, so we can hear our own still small voice within us and understand that there's a bigger idea asking to be born and asking to be given voice to, asking me needing to hear him, him needing me to hear him, and vice versa. It's a very beautiful thing. And so David Rico, who is a specialist in mindfulness, Buddhist practice, but also a specialist in relationships. And some of you might be familiar with this because it happens to be my favorite relationship book, but I think it also happens to be Dr. Andrea from Bellingham's favorite relationship book as well, because she mentioned it at the conference in Kelowna. And so he talks about the 5 steps of adult relationships. And this applies not just to intimate relationships, but to all relationships. You just have to kind of step back a little bit to sort of see the bigger picture. And so he says the number 1 is being attentive to the person. So that already encapsulates what we've talked about. The other one is that accepting that I talked about. The other one is being appreciative. So we may not always agree. I might not always agree with my dad, but if I can appreciate his perspective, if I can appreciate the gifts that he brings to the world that may be different from my own, I'm closer. I'm closer to creating that union and that one mind consciousness. Allowing, that's the giving space. Allowing that other person, reminding ourselves that we are always at choice, as is the other person at choice in whatever relationship we choose to be in. And then the last one is being affectionate, which sounds like it's more important for the intimate relationships, but the way that he speaks about it is that there is an affection that we all have for the world. And if we think about affection from that point of view, that we can extend, I have an affection for my coworkers. I want them to get up in the morning and be happy, because, you know, if they show up at my workplace happy, then it's a better day for everybody. So I have an affection for them. I have an affection for my neighbors because I want peace in their lives, et cetera, and we can extend out that affection in that kind of way. So I want to leave you with a couple of things to think about, some last things to think about. It is through, comes from Rabbi Sachs, it is through the word, speaking and listening, that we can have an intimate relationship with God as our parent, our partner, our sovereign, the one who loves us and whom we love. And Ernest Holmes says, let the inner ear listen to the voice of truth that is always speaking. So thank you.